Olá, começa agora o Agro América, programa produzido em parceria com o Instituto Interamericano de Cooperação para a Agricultura, o ICA, aqui no AgroMais. Meu nome é Gabriel Estrela e aqui falamos sobre boas práticas agrícolas que podem ser reproduzidas nos 34 estados-membros em prol de uma agricultura sustentável e o bem-estar rural. Hoje nós vamos falar sobre as sinergias entre a transformação rural, equidade de gênero e, sim, a conservação do meio ambiente. Para falar sobre essas sinergias, essas convergências dessas agendas, convidei um economista especializado em desenvolvimento rural, proteção social e avaliação dos programas de redução de pobreza. Ele é o Benjamin Davis, diretor da Divisão de Transformação Rural, Inclusiva e Equidade de Gênero da Organização das Nações Unidas para Agricultura e Alimentação. Ele já passou por vários cargos de liderança, é doutor em Economia Agrícola e mestre em Políticas Públicas pela Universidade da Califórnia. Benjamin, Mr. Davis, welcome to Agro América. It's a pleasure to have you here.
No, thank you very much, Gabriel, for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Well, you've been to Brazil several times, and you look at the continent on a general basis. I'd like to start out with you telling us a little bit more about your division. How does the division of rural transformation and gender equality work with different nations, both national governments, local governments, in order to extend and develop this agenda?
Of course. Yeah, no, thanks. Well, as you mentioned, I'm with the FAO, right? So it's Food and Agriculture, and we're a specialized agency that focuses on all the different sectors of agriculture, livestock, what have you. My division itself works with the people who work in agriculture, right? And so that's why we focus on gender equality, on both women and men who work in agriculture, as well as issues such as land tenure, decent work, social protection. And so it's really understanding the social dimensions of agriculture and agricultural production in the rural communities in which people live, okay? And so in that context, we work with countries, we work with governments to better share and discuss, good ideas, good practices in terms of addressing the constraints and the needs that particularly smallholder producers face. That's our focus. No?
Fair enough, fair enough. How does the agenda prioritize maybe the most vulnerable of the populations in the rural areas in Latin America and the Caribbean? We can say that most of the households in rural areas are headed by women with the presence of children. How does your agenda look at this population and work with different types of governments, both local and large, in order to develop public policy directed into improving their livelihoods, including improving their wages, including maybe productivity in the field in order to make their livelihoods and social needs improve?
Well, as you mentioned, I mean, in rural areas, there still is a big divide, let's say, between rural and urban areas. A lot of inequality. I mean, Latin America is the most unequal region in the world, really. And a lot of it is this inequality between rural and urban areas. And a lot of that has to do with the kind of livelihoods that characterize rural areas, which is primarily agriculture-based livelihoods, which by definition is a very risky undertaking in even the best of circumstances. And you add that a context of a lot of small-scale producers, for historical reasons, very unequal distribution of land, very unequal access to government services, to information, to markets, et cetera. It makes for a lot of challenges between the more marginalized sectors of the population in rural areas. And one important dimension of that is gender, right? And the fact that women face a very specific set of constraints and inequalities, really, in rural areas, both in terms of inequality and opportunities, having the same opportunities as men, as well as access to assets and resources and services, and just getting paid for the same amount of work. I mean, globally, for every dollar that a man earns in agricultural wage labor, a woman earns 82 cents for the same work, right? And so there's just a series of inequalities. And also important ones that people may not realize are really connected to the economic side. Just the fact that women are much more responsible for the care and domestic work. And the fact that they have to work 2 or 3 or 4 more hours a day than men makes it difficult for them to participate in the same way. in economic activities.
Exactly.
And so we work with governments to, on the first hand, it's really to just raise consciousness and just kind of point out, provide the evidence, really, because there's a lot of evidence showing these inequalities across these different dimensions. And then working with governments and with civil society, producer organizations, on the kind of steps that you can take to address some of these issues. And really one of the most important ones is, it's up here, really. It has to do with discrimination, it has to do with social norms, which make it difficult for women to participate in an equal way, right? And so one kind of program that we promote is what we call gender transformative approaches, which is really about addressing these social norms. And so that means not just working with women and with girls, but with men and with boys in a community context, to understand so that people can understand and see kind of the impact of these social norms. Also very important is directly addressing inequality and access to resources. So it's looking at land tenure security, looking at some of the let's say, institutional or constraints that women face. Some of it has to do with inheritance laws in different contexts, or ownership laws, right? Unequal ownership of land. So land is a big one, obviously, in the rural context. Yeah. But also, again, directly addressing this issue of inequality and access to extension, to information and services. More or less, in terms of education, more or less there's equality now. That's been reached. But in terms of most of the other dimensions, it's still very far behind.
Fair enough. Well, in the agricultural sector, we have a tendency to look at a lot of technology and a lot of productivity, look at pretty much where the producer can improve their wages. And we, as you said, women earn 18 cents less than men for the work that they produce, working longer hours, having more responsibility. So it's about working with conscientization of the population in order to make them aware of this disparity, of this inequality, which is historical around. One of the statistics I saw from your division is that if the global temperature would rise 1 degree above our current average, women would lose 34%, I think 34% of income in relation to men. Correct. So now we have a different dynamic, which is looking at climate change and how it impacts people's lives, especially women's lives, being the main caretakers of children. So what does that look in a practical sense? Like, what does that mean for them to lose on that 1 degree scale?
Yeah, it means that because of all the inequality in terms of all these different dimensions I was mentioning, it means they're much more vulnerable to risk, much more vulnerable to climate shocks or any kind of shocks, but particularly climate, because as we know, climate shocks have been increasing due to climate change. And it makes them more vulnerable and less able to adapt and to deal with those shocks, right? So it's an additional inequality and negative impact. Not only do they not have the same accesses, but when a shock comes, they're unable to face it. And so for this reason, it's important one important thing to focus on is the public policy, the policy towards the sector isn't gender blind, right? And it's important that the specific constraints that women face, and some of these may be constraints that public policy can address directly, such as laws and, again, inheritance laws, et cetera. But that these policies recommend specifically these constraints and have proposed actions and budget, most importantly, proposed budget to deal with them. Over the last 10 years, it's become much more fashionable to talk about gender equality, what have you. So there's a lot of talk, but when you get to the practical actions and the budget, which is really what's important, we're still far behind. And so we still really need to push in that aspect.
Fair enough. Well, last year, we saw that the average global temperature rose above the 1.5 degree mark signed at the Paris Accord about 10 years ago, where nations tried to find a way, still trying to find a way, in order to prevent for climate change to worsen, for the global average temperature to rise above pre-industrial levels, above this 1.5 degree mark. And we see that, our efforts have been lengthy, but they haven't been enough. Maybe we haven't been working hard enough maybe the synergies haven't been found yet or accorded between nations. So that is to say that within this time, women have already lost, according to your studies, a lot of these wages, right? They've already found themselves in a worse situation in terms of selling their produce, having access to different markets, which is to say that we need to look at these populations at a greater scale. What are your recommendations, main recommendations, when you speak to national governments in order to conscientize their work and their efforts into helping these populations improve how to deal with the inequality in the rural sector?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's on a number of fronts, let's say. So the first front is, again, specifically addressing these inequality in access to assets and to resources, right? So education has been more or less been taken care of. But in terms of the other assets that people need in order to develop economic activities. The second, as I mentioned, is addressing the social norms and the gender discrimination. This is fundamental. But this is a long-term process, right? It's a long-term process that has to come from below. It has to be worked at the grassroots. It's not something that any government or public, organization can just dictate, basically, because it's all about the social relations and what have you. So that's a long-term process. Another really fundamental policy is providing childcare. I mean, it seems like such a simple thing, but it's really it's the burden, that extra burden that women bear in terms of taking care of children as well as taking care of older folks and all the domestic work that they have to carry out, and that much more than men. There really is a constraint on their ability to participate in the economy, and so really. Formal childcare programs and after-school programs they're fundamental things to liberate women to be able to do what they would like to do. No? Other policies that are very important are social protection. Social protection is fundamental because it's a policy which allows you to manage risk. And again, these are poor households who don't have access to insurance. They don't have access to any kind of formal program which allows them to have any kind of shock absorber for shocks that they may face, whether it's climate or whether it's just getting sick, right, or a health shock, right? And so social protection allows people and women as well as men to manage risk, to have kind of an income which allows them to have some liquidity, right? Because the poor are basically cash poor, right? They don't have a lot of cash to be able, and allows them some economic flexibility, right? And it's also been shown, I mean, there's a lot of evidence on social protection that it facilitates women's employment and resilience, and kind of reducing their vulnerability to the shocks that I was mentioning before. Right? Fantastic. So that's a key. I think that's another key program.
Fair enough. Well, we're going to go for a short break. On our next block, I'd like to talk about social protection a little bit more to understand what are some of the tools that maybe countries and local governments can implement.
Okay? Great.
Para você que vem nos acompanhando, fique por aí que o Agro América volta em instantes. Até já. Olá, o Agro América está de volta. Hoje estou conversando com Benjamin Davis, que é o diretor da Divisão de Transformação Rural Inclusiva e Equidade de Gênero da Organização das Nações Unidas para a Agricultura e Alimentação. Just before our break, we were talking about the importance of social protection. Well, Brazil is a country that historically has developed a lot of public policies, especially towards our more impoverished population in order to get them out of this kind of impoverished status, including focusing on nutrition, including giving them access to more food, something that is key for the agriculture sector. But looking at for who is in the field, why is social protection important for them, especially for family farmers, let's say?
Yeah. No, social protection, well, and it's very important for agriculture, for family farmers and for agriculture more broadly. And I'm always amazed about how separate those worlds are, even though they totally come together, right? And it's the same issue even within the FAO where I work, right? All the people who work in agriculture as well, they don't see it immediately, right? But if you look at programs like Bolsa Familia in Brazil, or programs in Mexico, Oportunidades, the well-known program, when they operate in rural areas, actually most of the beneficiaries are small-scale producers, right? And so even though you have a program which is designed in the social welfare ministry, right? And no one in the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Rural Development knows nothing about it, even though this program is actually reaching, their target population, right? Small-scale producers. And that social protection is actually fundamental for the agricultural life, of the agricultural activities of those small-scale producers, even though it's a social program, even though the focus is on nutrition, or it's on children, or what have you. It's fundamental for agriculture, and that's because small-scale producers, almost by definition, they live in a world of risk, basically. And they don't have ways to manage that risk because they usually don't have agricultural insurance. They maybe don't even have health insurance. They don't have any formal way of dealing with that risk. And so what that means is that it's essentially it's a market failure, right? And so the social program, when they get this cash from the social program, and it's a regular cash that comes every month, they know it's going to come every month, it allows them to better plan their economic activities from the social transfer, right? In essence, a rural household that doesn't have insurance and is getting this cash transfer, it's hard to separate their consumption side from their production side because they might use that cash, a little bit of it, to buy some inputs or to do something in their economic activity, right? And so it allows them to make decisions in their agricultural production, which they wouldn't have been able to make if they hadn't been receiving that social program, that social protection, right? And so that has massive implications if you have a government ministry that has some kind of program which is targeted towards small-scale producers, and you also have the social program which is helping them on the risk side. It helps them able to adopt and to respond in a much better way to the programs that are coming from government for small-scale producers, right? And so that's why social protection is so fundamental to let's say, an agricultural household, and particularly to those who may be marginalized in this context, right? So whether it's, a female-headed household or a household where it's the woman who's doing the agricultural production, who's facing a whole nother set of vulnerabilities, it's even that much more important. Or if you're from a marginalized ethnic group, right, which faces also additional levels of discrimination and historical marginalization, again, it's a very important addition to the household. It helps them make much better economic decisions, let's say, and have a little bit more of a forward-looking look instead of always thinking about how am I going to survive to the next day, basically.
Now, looking at what we were talking about in terms of climate change, we have to look at also on conserving our ecosystems, because the degradation of our ecosystems is directly associated as well with how resilient and how we can adapt to these climate change responses in a day-to-day. In Brazil, your agenda also includes a debate that happened with the Ministry of Environment and climate change in Brazil, as well as the Inter-American Development Bank, in order to talk about these synergies, including how to conserve the ecosystem within the agricultural sector. I was wondering, what are the points that you're bringing or that you brought to this debate, and understand a little bit more about the importance of conservation, especially for the most vulnerable in our agricultural world, which is so diverse.
Of course, yeah. Well, I think the important thing here is that, again, small-scale producers are responsible for the management of a lot of the natural resources, a large share of the natural resources in this country and in many countries in the region. And small-scale producers that, again, face a lot of risk, may have a very a short time horizon because they're trying to survive, right? They may make decisions which focus on the short term rather than the long term, right? And in order to correctly manage natural resources, I mean, you really need to think about the long term, right? Because the long-term benefit to both the farmer as well as society comes in the long term, right? And so when you have, so there's kind of there's a failure right there, right? Because people are forced to look in the short term, but the only way we're going to take care of natural resources is by thinking of the long term and realizing kind of also what the contribution of the small-scale farmer is. Their small contribution in maintaining the natural resources in their land benefits everyone, right? When it's all put together in the aggregate. And so that's why a policy like social protection is so important for the management of natural resources, right? Because that's one, because it just expands the time horizon. It allows people to look more forward. It also allows them, it can be combined, when you actually design the social protection program, you can design it in a way that there are incentives that also further can bring about, a sustainable use of land, right? And so, and behavior change in a sense, right? And so also learning about, different techniques which may have a much longer term payoff than the kind of the short term techniques, right? And so it's important not only for the adaptation to climate change, right, to be able to adjust to the changing climate by changing your agricultural practices. And so social protection can help you do that because, again, it allows you to maybe do some things which don't bring you an immediate return right now, but might bring you a return in a year or two, et cetera. So it allows that transition to better adoption. And there's also going to be some places, some contexts where small-scale producers aren't going to be able to adapt anymore, right? They've kind of hit a wall because land has been degraded so much or the climate has changed so much that they really can't produce what they were before. And so in this case, social protection is also helpful, again, as part of, one, both kind of compensation and transition, right? Helping people move from the activity they were doing to another activity. In that case, though, you would need to combine social protection with, retraining and other kind of support so that people can begin to take up other economic activities.
Fantastic. Well, this kind of goes in line as well with one of Brazil's proposals for COP30, right? The United Nations Convention on Climate Change, which is scheduled for November 2025 in Belém. There's a lot of expectation of the discussions that will be held. Actually, the leaders' meeting was also anticipated in order for there to be more time between leaders to discuss the more difficult decisions. But one of Brazil's propositions was to improve and highlight climate finance. And this goes in line with what you're saying, which is to help developing countries have access to more finance, to more money in order to make their programs from agriculture to other sectors more climate resilient in order to adapt to the climate change that we can't halt in the short term anymore. With that sense, I'd like to know, what are your expectations for what will be discussed at COP30, which has so much expectations, but with regards to the agricultural sector?
Yeah, I mean, this is directly related to this debate that we're having. Because in this debate, we're trying to link another new initiative, which came out of the G20 last year, which is the Global Alliance on Poverty and Hunger, which was led by Brazil, which is all about scaling up national approaches to deal with poverty and hunger, of which social protection is fundamental, right? So trying to link what's being promoted and discussed within the Global Alliance to what's going to be discussed in the COP30 exactly along the lines of what you're saying, right? And so how can the scaling up of social protection also linked to the climate and to the conservation goals that are necessary in order to address and deal with climate change? And so a lot of that, so there'll be a lot of discussion around the different programs that do exist, kind of what are the design features that you need, what is the kind of the scale and the content of these programs that are necessary in order to get some of these synergies, right, for linking. No? But I think what's also really important is that there's a fundamental concept of climate justice, I think, as well, right, in terms of linking these two. Because my greatest fear going forward is that in terms of a lot of the climate action that's going to come in terms of mitigation, right, will really have negative effects for small-scale producers, right? because there will be controls over land use, there'll be controls over deforestation, there'll be controls over the use of natural resources, right? And the way the international system is set up now, it's really biased against small-scale producers, right? Because it's always cheaper to make small-scale producers in a lower-income country do something instead of in a wealthy country, reforest after they've already, cut down all their forest over time, right? And so my big fear is that, again, that the small-scale producers are going to pay the price. And so I think it's fundamental, this linking between social protection, between understanding the social and economic implications of both climate change adaptation and mitigation and what's necessary to address climate change and how that's going to affect small-scale producers. And I think, again, social protection is going to be one of those key policies to address this aspect of climate justice as well.
Fair enough. Well, unfortunately, we've come to an end of this program. I'd like to thank you so much for your time. And I'd like to invite everybody who's watching to look more at your division, to look at the work that you're doing, that, national governments and local governments can also participate in the development of public policy regarding social protection and as well as gender equity. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bom, o Agro América fica por aqui. Nós falamos sobre políticas públicas voltadas para o setor agropecuário, voltado principalmente para os pequenos produtores, com o intuito de avançar na equidade de gênero e o desenvolvimento inclusivo do setor agropecuário. Eu fico por aqui e convido vocês a assistirem este programa mais outros no nosso canal no YouTube, @AgroMais TV. Até mais!